Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Halliday, and I'm going to present today's CWA webinar. I'm with the Saskatchewan branch, and I'll moderate the session. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few things to ensure the webinar runs smoothly. The presentation will run for approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer period. At any time, you can type your comments or questions in the questions pane on the GoToWebinar control panel. All questions will be held and asked on your behalf at the end of a session. After the webinar is completed, it will be saved on YouTube with member-only access for those who participated. You can also go to cwa.org for more information or to sign up on future webinars. Our presenters today are Dr. Alain Petronero of the University of Calgary and Haley Carlson of the University of Saskatchewan. They will present the water chapter on the Natural Resources Canada in a Changing Climate National Assessment Report. Al received his PhD from the University of Waterloo and is currently professor and chair of sustainable water systems at the University of Calgary. He holds adjunct professorships at other universities, and many of you will know him as a former director of Environment Canada's Water and Climate Services. He is a recipient of that department's Citation of Excellence. Al's research pertains to numerical modeling of water resources systems and environmental remote sensing. He is currently president of the International Association of Hydrological Sciences Commission on Remote Sensing. Haley Carlson is the program manager with the Integrated Modeling Program for Canada, a global water futures project at the University of Saskatchewan. Her academic work pertains to human dimensions of environmental management. Her public policy master's research focused on the influence of stakeholder policy narratives on decision-making about water. She is currently a board member of the Saskatchewan Environmental Society and a board member of the SES Cooperative. So I'd like to turn that over to Al and Haley, and we'll get underway. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob. I'm just going to have my camera off for the presentation. I'll turn it back on in the question and answer period. I'm not sure what you are wanting to do there, Al.
Yeah, I'll leave my camera on during my parts and then I'll turn it off after. So did you want to start, Haley?
Sure, yeah, so I'll give an introduction. As Al had mentioned, we're going to be talking today about our work on the Water Resources chapter, which is one of the volumes in Canada in a Changing Climate series that is coordinated by the Natural Resources Canada. Al and I are presenting today, but we also have co-authors Stephanie Merrill, Wendy Ledger, and Patricia Gober. And just for a bit of background on what we're doing, the objective was kind of loosely defined, but we interpreted it as what we are doing around adaptation and how we are doing on adaptation relative to what we know are our best practices in the Canadian water sector. It's supposed to be an assessment and not prescriptive. So we reviewed quite a few pieces of gray and peer-reviewed literature, trying to emphasize pieces published after 2014. But the last assessment done specifically on water resources was in 2003. So we have quite a bit of ground to make up. The caveat was that there was a word limit of 15,000. So it was a lot of information in a really sort of short amount of words. So today we're going to just be going over the important themes. And the chapter actually hasn't been published yet, but we're expecting it will be in around June of this year. So you can find that and the material that has already been published on changingclimate.ca, which is the digital delivery platform for the information. And I'll pass it to you then, Al.
Sure. So Haley will just move the slides forward rather than pass over control. So, the first key message was really focused around our current understanding, I guess, of what's going on with respect to water resources, flows, floods and droughts, that kind of thing. And so we leaned heavily on work done in the first report, right? And that work was done by Barry Bonzels, and I'm going to refer to that a lot. Those of you in the water resources business know quite clearly that that the impacts of climate change on water resources is a bit of a something that's difficult to get a complete handle on. The translation of changes in temperature and changes in precip, which are really hard to model at the best of times. A lot more confidence in temperature than precip. Doesn't always lend itself well to do a proper assessment, and there's all kinds of scaling issues that we need to look at depending on the phenomena we're focused on, right? And so the group that did the work did a really nice job on trying to kind of lay out the risks in terms of what's known, what's very well known, and what's maybe a bit more speculative. So that really helped us set the context for the adaptive management discussions, because really in terms of adaptive management, we don't exactly know what the future holds. And hence the importance of having these adaptive management systems in place. And that's kind of the motivation. So we'll go to the next slide here, Haley. Thanks. So just to give you the background, I think everybody's probably aware of this, and I know Barry's actually given a talk in the past to this group, I believe. They were responsible for a chapter in the Canada's Changing Climate Report. It was initiated 5 years ago, and it was peer reviewed. And the folks focused on the water side of this was with one of the specific chapters was Barry Bonsall, who's with the National Hydrology Research Center in Saskatoon, Dan Peters, who's also an ECC scientist, Frank Siglenieks, who's with the National Hydrological Service, then Alfonso Rivera, who's a national lead on groundwater, and Aaron Berg, who's done a lot of work in soil moisture and remote sensing at the University of Guelph. So those were the chapter leads, and I'll just go through some of their preliminary assessments and sort of what they found, just to set the context for Haley's talk. And if you want to get the link is there, so if you haven't seen it, you can download it and have a look for yourself. So next one, please. So I don't think it's any surprise to this audience that there's a vast amount of fresh water in Canada. I'm always puzzled by the numbers. Maybe something CWRA should think about actually defining, but people, over 8,500 rivers, I would think there's actually a lot more depending on how you define a river. And then over 2 million lakes. Last count I heard was actually 5 million lakes in Canada. This came out of a study out of UCLA looking at mapping all the lakes in Canada. So the bottom line is there's a lot of water bodies in Canada. I'll make a plug for the water survey here. We only monitor about 2,800 of them. So from a sampling perspective, we really don't sample the landmass by any change, by any stretch of the imagination. Wetlands are probably about 16% of the landmass. And everybody's aware that these are fundamental to everything we do in Canada, including ecological integrity, hydro production, agriculture, drinking water, recreation, you name it. Next slide, please. So some of the indicators that were looked at through the work by Bonsall et al. Was looking at surface runoff. So an important factor is stream flow, obviously magnitude, timing, looking at different parts of the country, and looking at floods. Other elements were surface water levels in lakes and wetlands, soil moisture and drought, and then groundwater. So those are the 4 focal points for their work. Next slide, please. So on the stream flow side, what they looked at, and at the bottom, I'm not, on my screen, the bottom is not appearing here, but anyways, the subset is from the national, whoops, can you go back up? Was from the Reference Hydrometric Basin Network, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. That was done in 1999. Actually, it included about 255 stations, and it's you know, it's a bit unevenly distributed across Canada, depending on lots of factors, including the density of the observing network in those regions. But the whole premise of the database in 1999, which continues forward today, was to look at areas where storages didn't have much of an impact on the flow or had no impact, so there's no storage considerations. Land use hadn't changed very much. And so essentially, back in 1999, I was looking at systems that were considered stationary from a sort of a land use and water management perspective. So we can go to the next slide. So for those of you who aren't aware, I thought I'd put a plug in for the water survey here. So we pushed pretty hard. Certainly as the director, I pushed hard to update that system, which we've now accomplished. So if anybody's interested, and these data are available actually as an FTP download on the website. You can look at it. So now there's 318 stations considered of RH band quality. Well, you can see the map there for yourself. We've tried to cover as best as possible most of the ecotones in Canada. You know, certainly welcome anybody to have a look at the documentation on the website, which I provide on the bottom there. Next slide, please. So a part of the challenge, I think a lot of us who do this kind of work in trying to assess future changes with respect to hydrology is really, you know, trying to ascribe some kind of confidence to what we're seeing, right? So there's a challenge in terms of just observations. Are we noticing things happening over time? Is it possible to attribute those things directly to climate change? You know, is it part of sort of a natural trend that we see? And then, of course, there's looking at the future projections, you know, with pretty limited availability or pretty limited accuracy in some of the precipitation projections that we see coming out of these models. And of course, a whole level of uncertainty with respect to the ensemble of models that are being produced. And so this confidence and likelihood characterization that came out of the IPCC was used by Dr. Bonsall and his team, focused on confidence levels. So things that they felt that they saw strong evidence where they had very high confidence were labeled as such, moderate evidence, medium, and low. And so when looking at the different attributes mentioned earlier, stream flow and groundwater and floods and droughts, this is how they characterize them in terms of what they saw might be happening in the future. And so we'll go through that very quickly here just to give you a bit of background information. So the next slide, please. So in terms of what we're seeing, and I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, we're seeing higher temperatures, we're seeing warmer temperatures over earlier in the year. And so there's a fair bit of confidence that spring peak flow, stream flow, and snowmelt is occurring earlier with higher winter and earlier spring flows. I think there's a lot of confidence or high confidence in that statement. In terms of summer flows, there's medium confidence that we've seen reduced summer flows, and then the seasonal change. You know, again, it goes back to sort of a degree of subjectivity here, but seasonal change is projected to continue with shifts from more snowmelt-dominated regimes towards rainfall-dominated regimes. There's a lot of evidence for that in the mountains, obviously. And so there's a fair bit there's high confidence around sort of those general statements about what we're seeing. So, you know, the figure on the right kind of shows you sort of what we're seeing in general. You can't apply this generically to every basin. It all depends on elevation. It depends on, you know, very subtle changes in things like phase change for precipitation, which, you know, are hard to capture at the scales that these models are working at. But, you know, the observations and some of the projections that we're seeing are sort of lending us to this kind of view of the future, right? So that's sort of the take-home message, I guess, on stream flow. Next one, please. In terms of trends, so there's been a lot of work published both at the RHBN level and other work published, sort of pan-Canadian approach. So in general, when you look at annual flows, so mean annual flows, there tends to be an increase in mean annual flows in most places across the country, with some exceptions in the prairies, but it's a bit of a mixed signal there too, if you look at the plot. So again, Barry Bonsall and his team ascribed medium confidence to sort of the projected future changes in annual stream flow in Canada, which is probably a reasonable way to go here, given all the uncertainties. Next, please. So in terms of flooding, there's a lot of evidence now to show that extreme precipitation is increasing. We've seen storms on the prairies even that we certainly haven't seen before in recorded history. We're seeing higher intensity events. We're seeing longer duration events as well. When you think of the floods in 2011 in Minot, that was a month of rain that I think was unprecedented for a summer. We've seen a lot more higher frequency, I think, of flooding in the prairies over the last few years. And so all that anecdotal evidence and what we're seeing in some of the records is really kind of leading us to believe that at least in terms of extreme precipitation, we have a high confidence this is a future we have to prepare for. In terms of high temperatures and floods associated with spring snowmelt, again, this one gets a little tricky, right? Because these higher temperatures, you can make the argument that it shifts the snowmelt period, and you might have more melt in a shorter time period, but it's extremely complex because of ice jam, because of non-contributing areas issues on the prairies, sublimation of snow, all those things. And so I think a medium confidence level is probably warranted for understanding that. And it's really uncertain how projected higher temperatures and reductions in snow cover will affect the frequency and magnitude of future snowmelt related flooding. It's a complex issue that's really not resolvable as easily as one would hope. And so, there's probably a lot of effort that needs to be done to try to understand the future there. So, okay, next slide, please. In terms of drought, and we've lived through a few of those, or at least I have since I've been on the prairies. And so using things like PDSI in different parts of the country, Bonsall and his team came to the conclusion that there's basically medium, there'd be more frequent and intense droughts across the southern prairies and BC. And they ascribe some medium confidence that based on some of the projections and some historical values around things like the Palmer Drought Severity Index. We can go to the next slide, please. The groundwater is difficult, as everybody knows. We don't have a national system of monitoring groundwater. There is a national database, but it's really voluntary. And so it's really hard to assess groundwater level trends in Canada. So Alfonso Rivera probably would have dedicated a lot of his time on this project to this effort, actually. And so if you look at it from a recharge perspective, based on what we're seeing on precipitation, I think what's stated here makes sense. And then as a result of earlier snowmelt as well, the recharge is probably going to occur earlier in a future climate scenario. And again, they ascribe a medium confidence to that as well. But that one is very, very difficult. I think it's just so many factors will influence that, but they did the best they could, I'm sure. Okay, next one, please. So in terms of general conclusions, then, you can read them for yourselves, but I think what's important to understand is the impacts. We're starting to see them now from climate change. It's difficult to ascribe them directly to climate change, but we see that things are changing. We have confidence, high confidence in some of these variables, medium confidence in others. So these conclusions kind of lead us to what's required with respect to how to deal with it from a socioeconomic perspective. And I think that sort of confirms the fact that we need to develop adaptive management approaches to help deal with this uncertainty. You know, the argument could be made that if we knew exactly what the future would hold, which is almost impossible to do, then you can design for it, right? From an engineering perspective, that's possible, but we don't. And so, you know, how are we going to adapt? How are we going to move this forward? So Haley will talk about that and sort of brings what we saw from different perspectives across Canada on dealing with adaptive management, and sort of our overall impression of kind of the state of the art of adaptive management as it stands about now. I guess things change quite quickly. So, and then Haley, I guess I'll talk about the last slide quickly, and then we'll go to yours, or the next slide quickly. So in the report, you'll see sort of anecdotal evidence, I guess, of what we're seeing with respect to hydrological related disasters in Canada. You know, I can say also from personal experience, having basically been the executive director of the Water Survey since 2006, and dealing with most of the transboundary basins across the country, that you know, we're seeing just more evidence on an annual basis of extreme events, just things that we didn't see back in the 90s. And I can defer to Bob Halliday and others on this, but it seems to me that anecdotally anyways, we're seeing just a lot more extreme events. I know for the Water Survey, we had to gear up for floods. Every year we were getting calls from folks in the military about trying to anticipate, you know, where they would have to send troops, you know, in March, you know, that kind of thing, which, you know, and starting in 2006, we never heard that. And then by about 2010, 2011, right, these were sort of, you know, there's a sort of a constant view, at least at the federal level, of being on guard for extreme events in the spring, right? And so it went from being sort of a quiet brief to being a very active brief in terms of the federal government on what was going to happen in the spring. They wanted to know what the snowpacks looked like. They wanted to know, you know, where is it going to flood? And sometimes you can't answer the question, but at least you can advise them on where there's some higher likelihoods. And so it became part of the conscience, I guess, of the federal government. You know, I'd say starting about 2010, where now it's actually part of kind of an annual ritual for the Hydrological Service in Canada to kind of inform the minister's office, you know, where there could be some potential issues across the country. So this kind of highlights a lot of what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years, and it certainly is a harbinger, I think, for things to come. So on that note, Haley, I'll leave it to you to continue on with the adaptive stuff.
Sure, thanks, Al. You know, after we had sort of made that bridge between Dr. Bonsall and his team's chapter on what we're seeing in terms of impacts to water systems and what we can anticipate in the future, we started to make the link to, you know, what are people doing, what are different organizations doing in the water sector to prepare for these changes and to adapt to them. This section we did first, following the sort of science theme section, focused on the ways we are coordinating to reach our adaptation goals. So overall, there are some leaders in Canada, but there are also other groups that have less capacity to act on the issue, which leaves them more vulnerable to impacts. So as you know, the primary jurisdiction over water lies with the provinces in Canada. But of course, in practice, there's a lot of different groups involved in governance and management activities, and therefore adaptation tends to occur at a variety of scales in Canada. And a key characteristic of modern water governance in Canada is the entry and increasing participation of different sorts of groups in management that weren't there historically. So groups like municipalities, Indigenous communities, and environmental organizations are starting to enter those conversations and have a more prominent influence in those conversations. And and they can introduce new types of ideas and adaptive strategies to the existing context. So we are seeing a bit of a decline in the role of the federal government relative to what it was historically. So as an example to that in the chapter, to those dynamics, we provided a box providing a bit of a background on the current context for flood management in Canada. Flooding, of course, is one of the most costly natural disasters in Canada. And Al has been quite involved with these conversations. So I'm actually going to invite him to just spend a couple minutes talking about this one. You'll have to unmute yourself though, Al.
I know I had to figure out how to do it. Yeah, so those of you, and I know Bob Halliday, you'll remember this from the old FDRP days. A lot's changed, I guess, since the program was stopped, I guess, in 1996, which, in my mind was probably not the smartest move that Canada ever did with respect to floodplains. And so what's happening now is well, a few things. One is that the flood damages have certainly gone up. And so there's concern at the federal level about payments. That's no doubt. There's been, I think, some evidence showing that there's been encroachment in floodplains in many parts of the country. And so, how do you deal with that, right? Are people actually respecting the old rules, the old FDRP rules around floodplain management? I don't think the federal government's in a good position to really understand that. The other issue, I think, is there's been a lot of gentrification in some of these regions where perhaps in the 80s and 90s, there were warehouse areas where it was a low impact in terms of costs for flooding, and now they're really expensive condos. And so that has a higher impact in terms of cost. And then, of course, there's the climate change attribute as well, right? So are things changing? We're in a non-stationary system right now, right? And so how do we deal with that? How do we incorporate climate change into our planning, and how to develop a policy around how to do that? And so there's a lot of challenges right now. There's the NDMP funding, I think that most people are aware of, that came up through public safety. And NRCan is leading an effort here with floodplain mapping across Canada. But I think, in my personal opinion, I guess what I see lacking is really kind of a policy cover on where this has to go and how we deal with it. And from an adaptive management perspective, how we're going to deal with it as well. So it'd be really interesting actually to get other people's opinions down the road here about how this can all work. But it's pretty fragmented, I think, in Canada. The provinces, obviously they have the responsibility, but the federal government does pay out a fair bit of money when there's a disaster. And so I think probably an enhanced coordination between the federal and provincial governments and probably an adaptive management type of approach to dealing with the floodplain issue is going to be critical for success in Canada. And then the last thing I'll say is there's a vested interest of the insurance industry as well, which is legitimate. And so they need to play into that as well. So we'll have to see how it all turns out. But those are the things I've observed over the last 5 or 6 years in trying to deal with this file. Thanks, Haley.
Thanks, Al. So before I spoke about uneven adaptive capacity, and much of the literature pointed to, high levels of adaptive capacity depend on access to adequate technical, human, social, and financial capital. But in interviews that I read through, syntheses of interviews, and we also did a few interviews with water practitioners across Canada ourselves, people were speaking about their perceptions of declining levels of technical skills. There was a lot of employee turnover and burnout they felt, and a lack of stable funding for adaptation initiatives. Practitioners were also seemed to be looking for different types of skills than they might have historically. So one person called this a unicorn person, quote unquote, and they were referring to a person who has some technical skills, but also interdisciplinary experience and who could work well with lots of different types of people. And one group we focus on in the chapter is municipalities. So as you can see on the graph in this slide, municipalities have been slowly accumulating larger amounts of public infrastructure over time, while public federally owned infrastructure is declining. But as much as they are responsible for large chunks of our public infrastructure, they often lack capacity to raise the type of revenue necessary to maintain and upgrade that infrastructure. And I also had this is a little image here from the Canadian Infrastructure Report Card. This is from the 2019 report card. It offers a little glimpse of what state is our water infrastructure in across Canada. The 2016 report card goes a bit more in depth about climate change and reveals that, well, about half of municipalities have undertaken a risk assessment of their water-related assets. Fewer than 20% of them have formally introduced adaptation strategies. So there is quite a bit of potential vulnerability there in municipalities. So then we were reviewing the type of adaptation strategies people are pursuing as they pertain to coordination and adaptive capacity. Partnerships was one of the most frequently mentioned strategies, especially when I was interviewing people that people would mention. This is a way people are trying to facilitate information sharing between organizations, trying to build trust and cooperative mechanisms, and add to those technical and human resources that may not be there in-house for them. Another thing that was helping was that larger institutions or governments were providing support for local adaptation efforts. So one of the examples here is the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. ICLEI is their acronym. They're a network of local governments and staff, and they can provide technical capacity and networking opportunities for municipalities. And this has been a real key driver of mitigation and adaptation at the municipal level in Canada, because municipalities are able to access that additional level of capacity from the network. The two studies that I mentioned on this slide were different studies that looked at analyzing approaches to flooding in different regions in Canada. So Morrison and his colleagues interviewed practitioners, and they do a document analysis in the Prairie region, and they were looking for evidence of resilience-based approaches to flood risk management. So they do find, as you see on the pie chart there, quite a diverse set of strategies aligning with the 5 different flood risk management approaches they were looking at, which speaks well to adaptive capacity. And then additionally, Daniel Henstra and Jason Thistlethwaite, they're with the University of Waterloo. Their study, they look at policy instruments in Toronto and Calgary as they pertain to flood risk. And they find that most approaches are still hazard-based, which means that they're focused exclusively on the probability of the hazard occurring, as opposed to risk-based, which incorporates both the probability of the hazard occurring as well as consequences of the hazard due to exposure and vulnerability. So there we're seeing a diversity of approaches being applied, but not necessarily the full range available to practitioners. Another strategy groups we're pursuing in this arena was the incorporation of diverse sources of knowledge. So one of the examples we looked at in detail was the Northwest Territories Northern Voices Northern Water Stewardship Strategy, which was developed collaboratively by Indigenous communities and territorial governments. And the documents explicitly include provisions for recognizing Indigenous rights, and it considers Indigenous knowledge equivalent to Western science. It also takes an adaptive management approach, because they do treat the document as a living document with routine checks and actions adjusted as necessary as new information becomes available. And that their links to traditional knowledge offer them more information about variables that they weren't necessarily aware of, because, as you know, Northern Canada, it does tend to be more data sparse relative to other regions in Canada. So another thing we had looked at in depth, we do 2 case studies in this section of the chapter, exploring the role of watershed organizations and transboundary organizations, which really play a strong role coordinating in the water sector in Canada. So 2 of the ones we look at in depth are the Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority in Ontario, and their efforts to introduce a climate change adaptation strategy for Lake Simcoe in Ontario. And then also the International Joint Commission, which is the most prominent transboundary organization in Canada. And they have done a lot of work. Well, there are still issues on the Great Lakes, as the area we looked at in particular. Well, there are still issues there. The cooperation between United States and Canada, which has largely been facilitated by the IJC, has slowed substantial ecological damage in the basin. We're going to talk a little bit about one of their assessments later on here, and I'll invite Al to speak to that. In terms of the next section, moving on from coordination, we started to look at what innovative approaches are we observing in the literature in terms of how people are pursuing adaptation in the Canadian water sector that are in line with the best practices for adapting conditions of deep uncertainty. So Al talked about those uncertain conditions earlier. One of the traits that was identified in the literature was the importance of leadership and how fundamental leadership is to innovation. So in one study by Danica Straith and her colleagues that's talked about on this slide, she interviewed people who were identified as water leaders in the Canadian water sector. And these were the traits that she found amongst those people she interviewed. These people had strong networks and they made use of them. They weren't necessarily self-described as great public speakers, but they felt strongly that it was a necessary role they had to play to disseminate information to other groups and the public. And they had a good sense of when to take risks particular to their context and could act strategically to make change in ways that weren't socially or professionally threatening to them. Another strategy groups are pursuing is engaging stakeholders in scenario exercises. So this involves simulating or exploring potential futures with the goal, among other goals, of developing adaptation options that are going to perform reasonably well no matter how the future unfolds, because there is that uncertainty in the future. So we looked at two case studies. Many of you are probably familiar with the Alberta Water Smart study that took place in the South Sask River Basin. The exercise involved working with stakeholders to develop a set of plausible future water supply and demand scenarios and develop a set of adaptation options. So the graph you're seeing on the screen, or the image you're seeing on the screen, is the adaptation options that were considered level 3, or the most resilient options. And within those, the option of building a new on-stream reservoir lower in the Bow system was considered the most promising. And I'll invite Al to talk a little bit about the International Upper Great Lakes study, because he was pretty closely involved with that effort.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. So you know, the approach we took on the International Upper Great Lakes study was perhaps a little different than what you'd think of, and it really sort of lent itself to more of an adaptive management approach from the beginning, as opposed to anything else. In that, you know, we looked at things like coping zones, so you can see there for the different lakes, you know, where stakeholders felt they what the limits were in terms of what they thought was reasonable for whatever endeavor they were interested in, whether it was recreational boating or navigation or you know, whatever that turned out to be. And so we sort of reversed the process a little bit in saying that to the stakeholders, okay, what can you live with in terms of water levels and lake levels? And then looked at the plausibility of those scenarios actually occurring with the climate change models that we were running, as opposed to the other way, which is, you know, a more typical approach where you generate a whole bunch of scenarios and say, okay, here's what the possible lake levels in the future are going to look like. So it was an interesting approach, and it sort of lent itself to this whole adaptive management effort by pushing that forward. So it was kind of a unique way of looking at it, and actually we've adopted that sort of approach in some of the other IJC studies as well. And so it was interesting. The other thing I'll say quickly is adaptive management. You know, it was undertaken in a big way after the Upper Lakes study, because you know, we went from extreme lows to extreme highs in the lake levels, but the whole notion of adaptive management is now being incorporated into all the transboundary studies as they go forward. So it's being taken quite seriously by the IJC, US and Canadian sections. Thanks, Haley.
Thanks, Al. So so we're hearing there that the IJC is really a leader in this in Canada. In terms of how other jurisdictions are doing, this was one study I found looking at some of the water-related policies and programs in BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. This particular study found that these policies don't always include explicit monitoring and review processes, and those don't always necessarily feed back into policy reviews or adjustments. So you see there in the little pie chart that for about 38% of them, a formal review is required and reports are public, but you're also seeing 52% where a review is done periodically, but they're not necessarily producing a public report. It's not necessarily feeding back into adjustments to the policy or program to adapt to new conditions or new information as it arises. And this next slide here just shows some of those policies. So we're seeing, and actually I noticed as I was putting together this conversation that NRCan has switched the colors here. So the top right in this graph is supposed to be green. So we're seeing the Water Act modernization in BC showing really high levels of adaptive capacity. And then all the way down, some of the goals in the Saskatchewan 25-year water security plan, which they evaluated all the goals separately, are showing sort of lower levels relatively of adaptive capacity there. And this tool judges or assesses the policies and programs as it pertains to the identified stressor and also to the ability of the policy or program to adapt to changing conditions and unanticipated changes that may arise during the time when the policy program is implemented. So the next section of the chapter here, I'm just being cognizant of time, so I am going pretty quickly through the rest of the slides here. So this next section really speaks to public opinion and attitudes, which was identified in the literature as a key element to making progress on adaptation. So in general, in Canada, water is perceived to be really abundant and of high quality, and tends to rate lower than other issues in people's minds. So you see on the graph here, this is from the RBC Canadian Water Attitude Study in 2017, was the last time they did a survey here. We're seeing water issues and climate change be less salient in the minds of Canadians than issues like cost of living, adequate healthcare, and economic problems. We also saw in the literature that people tend to self-report low levels of preparedness for extreme events. So we were seeing in a few different studies, numbers like around 30–35% of people saying that they were prepared for a flood, for example. And there was also this disconnect between practitioner and public perspective. So practitioners identified aging infrastructure as a key threat to our ability to remain resilient to climate change impacts, but only 1 in 5 Canadians believe that major infrastructure investments are required. And overall, though, there is some skepticism and regional differences here if you look at the surveys, but overall, people are wanting government to play a strong role in protecting this resource. Some of the policies that scored well with people were enforcing stricter regulations and I guess, hoisting the costs on water supply, the full cost of water supply on commercial and industrial users. And this graph on this page is from a different study that shows a survey of about 2,300 Canadians who identified to what extent they believe each of those groups should play a role in either protecting against flood risks, so that's the bluey green kind of color, or paying for damage from flooding, that's the orange. And of course, you can see insurance companies are considered to be highly responsible for paying the damage from flooding and have that vested interest, as Al mentioned before. Some of the strategies we saw in terms of building public support was one that actually didn't make it on the slide, but I want to talk about is opportunity windows. So one of the practitioners in particular we spoke to in Manitoba attributed the eventual passing of the Sustainable Watersheds Act in Manitoba to increase public attention about flood control benefits associated with wetland retention following 2011 and 2014. So that increased public attention enabled people to sort of push through adaptation options that may not have been possible otherwise. This is some original research that we did as part of this chapter, doing a document analysis of programs and policies, water-related programs and policies in the Canadian prairies, looking at what water issues are people talking about and what kinds of policy approaches are they considering to address these issues. So again, here we saw a pretty wide range of diversity of policy approaches being discussed, all the way from built infrastructure such as a dam, natural infrastructure, market-based or economic policies such as water pricing, or organizational policy tools, which focus more on cooperative agreements and coordinated drought and flood plans. Water-related hazards were also the most popular water issue that showed increasing trends of discussion over time. So this last section here, we focused on reducing vulnerabilities, and particularly it analyzes the ability of our water system or information systems to inform resilient design and our adaptive capacity or our infrastructure design and maintenance. So in terms of our information systems, Al talked a little bit about this, and as I'm sure you all know, high quality, systematic, regularized data collection is not always the norm in many parts of Canada. And vulnerability studies we found are pretty regularly pursued, but is often by a very different groups of people, a different variety of organizations, and they all are using different methodologies. So it's a not very standardized approach in Canada right now. The image you're seeing on the screen was a synthesis of 25 vulnerability assessments across Canada. As you can see, they noted that it can be pretty computationally expensive to get the right climate change information to really do a robust vulnerability analysis. And also that some jurisdictions are using very dated methodology still. So they had specifically cited the city of Welland in Ontario that was still using a 1963 IDF curve as recently as 2012. So that was the case that we're still seeing organizations use very dated information. In terms of infrastructure, the thing I want to discuss here is the main vulnerabilities that practitioners had pointed out. And largely, Al had already hinted at this. I can't remember if he said it outright, but basically that a lot of design and operating rules are still based on empirical records from the past rather than anticipated future conditions. There's also a tendency to not account for low probability events with highly adverse impacts in either design of new projects or upgrading existing projects, and as a consequence, perhaps less investment in emergency planning and preparedness. And there also is it's just very costly to build, maintain, or upgrade infrastructure to new design standards or new regulatory standards that can be increasingly stringent over time. In this section, we do spend a bit of talking about the protocol developed by the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee, which is a 5-step procedure to systematically assess engineering vulnerability and risk from climate change impacts, and it has been applied in some case studies across Canada, but is still not sort of an institutionalized systematic. Well, it is systematic, but it isn't an institutionalized approach at this point in time. And then almost to the conclusion here, Bob, just so you know, we also spend a little bit of time talking about natural infrastructure, which is not yet widely implemented across Canada, largely because of a lack of knowledge and expertise and policy and regulatory processes that favor built infrastructure. And just to clarify as well, like natural infrastructure can be fully natural, such as conserving a wetland, but it can also be engineered. So restoring a wetland, for example, and Pelly's Lake is an example of that. As you can see on the slide, there is quite a few success stories, however, where people are either preserving or building new types of natural infrastructure that is providing millions of dollars worth of benefits and a lot of co-benefits as well that might not be achieved with built infrastructure. So in conclusion, we do provide a few pages on knowledge gaps and research needs. I think primarily when we were trying to set the stage for the chapter and making the bridge between all the research and current and future trends by Dr. Bonsall and his team, and then the adaptation actions people are pursuing, we really tried to emphasize the uncertainty and complexity up front. So the adaptation options that we examined we evaluated sort of in light of how they will serve us in that uncertain and complex context. And I think, as you probably understood from the content we discussed, our current impression from reviewing the material and case studies is that, there is these pockets of innovation and adaptation success stories. They're definitely happening in the Canadian water sector. We're seeing demonstrations of those adaptation best practices. But there is this sort of lack of institutionalized, sometimes systematic, national level approaches to some of these issues, which can leave particular segments of society more vulnerable to adverse impacts in the long term. So with that, I'll leave that there. I'm sure Bob is relieved that we're finished 5 minutes over time, but I don't know if Al, you want to add any sort of concluding remarks here.
No, that's great. I think if we're allowed to take questions, we'll do that. Thanks, Haley. It's all good.
Okay, thank you both. And if there are any questions, could you type them in the questions pane on the panel, and we'll pass those on to Haley and Al. While we're waiting for you to type, I wonder, it's probably a question more for Haley than for Al, but it applies to both of you perhaps. Is there any literature or studies that show whether increased certainty leads to more proactive action by either people or institutions? I'm thinking of the IPC going from highly improbable to highly probable. If you increase the probability of an event or an outcome, do people start to take different actions, I guess?
I just realized I was muted. I didn't come across anything specific to that in compiling this chapter. I mean, anecdotally, I would say yes. I'm not sure if Al is aware of anything like that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Bob. And I don't think anybody's actually looked at that, right? We all cry for certainty, but I do recall dealing with some extreme events in the past, and going to reservoir operators and saying, okay, you have a perfect forecast because you know what happened last year. Would you have behaved any differently with a perfect forecast? And usually the answer is no. So that's a great question, and maybe something that should be pursued, in terms of adaptive management, right? What does certainty actually mean in terms of decision making? It's unclear. Thanks.
I'll just add, Bob, that I'm sure that there's literature in the decision-making sciences around that, but I don't know if it would pertain specifically to water and how the water sector context would influence, that particular question.
Yeah. In my simplistic way of doing business, sometimes I ask people, have you been flooded before? And said, if they say yes, I've been flooded before, I said, you'll be flooded again. And but even that doesn't seem to move them sometimes.
Well, we do talk a little bit about the adaptation effect in the chapter itself. So people who have experienced, recent levels of flooding being, or recent flood or drought events tend to have higher levels of adaptive capacity relative to those who haven't experienced for a while. So I guess you're seeing, it's sort of a cognitive bias in a sense, is that it's just blowing that event up in people's minds. So they do tend to be more prepared and are more certain that it's going to occur in the future relative to someone who hasn't experienced that event in recent years.
Yeah. Okay. Just one question here. Oh, it's a question for Al, and it's in that illustration you showed of sort of past and future stream flow. The question is that relating to a specific watershed, or was it a generalized figure, Al? Showing the,
Yeah, no, it's a cartoon. So it basically just shows kind of a general trend across Canada, but it's not related to any specific gauge.
And I don't see any other questions. So last chance for a question, anyone? Well, I think we'll wrap it up at this point, and I'd like to thank Al and Haley for their respective universities for their time and contributions today, and thank you all for attending. And the next presentation in this series will be on March 9th, so check the CWRA website for further information. And it is an IJC presentation. You gave them quite a few good promos, Al, so, and Haley. But anyway, we'll thank you everybody for attending, and have a good day. Thank you. All right.